We've worked a bit with Turtles and Tkinter, and we're going to continue playing with some of these aspects, but before we continue, it's probably important that we talk a little bit about object-oriented programming. As we've been working with the Turtles and as we've been working with Tkinter, we're starting to change the way that we do some of the things. Now, right now, we haven't done a whole lot of that yet, but as we're doing things with Tkinter, where we're creating buttons, and we're displaying data, and we're changing the data depending on what buttons a user might click, we're changing the way we're kind of looking at programming. It's no longer really about just having this executable that just does thing after thing after thing, but now it's more getting into, if a user interacts with this thing, then do this. If a user interacts with that thing, then do this. And that requires programming things a little differently than before, because we can't just have a series of decisions made at a certain time, because instead it needs to be sort of listening for all of these things to happen when they might happen instead. So it's waiting sort of for events to happen between objects or interactions to happen with objects. And this is really more the way that our everyday life works in general. If you're thinking about real life, you're using a computer right now. You probably have a cell phone. You might actually be watching this from a cell phone. You're probably sitting on some sort of chair. All of these things exist even if you're not thinking about them, and each one of these has its own behaviors that can happen depending on what you're doing. So this video might be playing right now, and you might be interacting with it or listening to it, or hopefully you're listening to it, but you also might have a cell phone in your pocket. But your cell phone could decide to speak up and make some noise depending on if someone decides to call, or if you have an alarm set, or if all of a sudden it's low on battery and it decides to notify you. So you have different things around you that you can interact with. Depending on what time it is, you might be eating breakfast or lunch or dinner, and those objects exist, and they have certain attributes and behaviors or events that can happen when you interact with them. So object-oriented programming is sort of thinking about programming more in the way that real life works, where we have different things in our program, like a button, like a field of text, or some other object that can be displayed, that can be interacted with. So hopefully that gives you sort of a rough idea of how we think about object-oriented programming, and it will make more sense as we go through it. Now, this isn't a super modern thing, actually. Object-oriented programming isn't new, but it is the most popular form of programming in software development today. It actually dates back to the 50s and 60s at MIT, but it didn't really start becoming popular until the late 80s and the 90s. When we talk about object-oriented programming, we're talking about objects, obviously. And when we talk about objects in programming, there are sort of two things that these objects have that we think about. They have attributes and they have methods. And you might hear other words for these at times. I might even use other words for these at times. You have attributes, which you might hear someone refer to as a characteristic or a property. You have methods, which you might hear someone refer to as a behavior or a procedure. So they're sort of interchangeably used, but essentially an object has an attribute, and an object has certain things that can be done with it. So if my object is a pen, its attributes might be what type of ink does it have. Its attributes could include what color is the ink. It could also include what is the pen made out of. Is it a plastic pen, just a cheap plastic pen? Does it have a fancy wooden case around it? Are parts of it metal? Is it just a ballpoint pen? Is it some sort of fancy calligraphy pen? And of course it also has methods, like I can write with the pen. If the pen runs out of ink, and hopefully it's not just a little cheap disposable one, I can probably replace the ink. I can put the cap on the pen, or the little clicky ones where I can click the end to make the writing part go away. So that's kind of the idea of an object, with it having attributes and methods. Now, an object isn't just its own individual separate thing. An object is an instance of a class. So I mentioned a pen, so it might be just some little disposable pen that I got from the store. It might be some special order custom made pen. Regardless of which pen it is, they are both pens. They are both instances of some sort of class, and they both have certain characteristics decided by that class. So whether it's a cheap pen or it's an expensive pen, they both should write. So writing is a behavior of the idea of a pen. However, whether it's a clicky type pin on the back, or whether it has a cap, that might be a particular attribute of this specific pen. And whether it's a blue ink pen or a black ink pen, or whether it's something playful like pink or cyan or like a lime green, those are attributes of that specific pen. And so this gets to the idea of inheritance. So an individual object inherits certain things from its class. So the fact that a pen writes is inherited from its overarching pen class. And you might say, well, I've got this really garbage pen over here that doesn't write at all. Well, okay, but it's supposed to write, and pens in general write, and so the fact that your pen doesn't happen to write is a specific attribute of that pen that you have, and the expectation that it should write is inherited from the idea of it being a pen. And so as we discuss this, you can also look at this as these things having variables, right? So some of these variables are class variables, and some of these are instance variables. A pen being able to write is sort of a class variable, right? So the variable can write equals true is attributed to the pen class itself, whereas perhaps, say, ink color would be attributed to that particular instance of the pen. So whether it's blue or green or red or black is particular to that instance of a pen and is a instance variable, whereas the ability to write should be a class variable. And of course there may be exceptions, like you have a garbage pen that was cheaply made and doesn't work, or you've used up all the ink in your pen and need to replace it. But the idea of a pen writing is a class variable. And you also have sort of class behaviors and instance behaviors. So the behavior of writing with a pen, like not the idea that it can write, but the idea of actually picking up the pen and moving it around on paper to get it to make marks on the paper, that is a behavior or a method of the class pen. Now whether it has a cap and I can take the cap and put it on the pen to close it, or whether it has the little clicky thing on the back, that might be an instance behavior or an instance method. It is a method of that particular pen on whether I have to click the back thingy or whether I have to put a cap on it. And of course if you've lost the cap, you might not be able to close it at all. Now you could argue that the idea of closing a pen, whether it's a clicky thing or a cap, might be a method of the whole class, and sure, you could argue that, but you could also argue that sort of the method in which to solve that method, sort of a sub-method, would be the clicky thingy or putting the cap on it. That's a little bit about objects in general. Now there's more that we need to talk about with this, but I think that's enough for this video, and we'll get a little bit more into it in the next one. So maybe look at some of the things in your daily life and think about what are attributes and behaviors that come from the overarching idea of that object versus what are attributes and behaviors that come from that specific instance of it.